Welcome to Sarder TV. I'm Vaishali Jain. We're excited to have Glen Weyl join us today. Glen is principal researcher at Microsoft and also the co-author of a book called Radical Markets, and he's here to tell us more. Glen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be here.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and a little bit about where you've worked.
So I'm an economist by training. I have my PhD in economics, and I was a professor at the University of Chicago for a time. But then I moved a little bit towards industry. I've been a researcher at Microsoft for the last few years. And then recently I wrote this book, Radical Markets, and that sort of shifted my life around quite a bit. It's kind of started a whole group of startups and a social movement around it. So now I'm doing a range of other activity, trying to organize that and build a community around the ideas that I'll be talking to you about today.
Tell us a little bit about your role as a researcher at Microsoft. What are you responsible for? It's
an amazing role because Microsoft actually is, I believe, the largest employer of PhD computer scientists in the world. Most people don't know this, but they really have an operation that's sort of like Bell Labs used to be, where they have, 1,000 PhDs who really have a lot of freedom to pursue what they think are the most important things. And the hope is that if you have enough bright people like that, things will bubble out of it that will eventually pay dividends for Microsoft. So I'm in a role like that, and they've given me the freedom to write this book. They've given me the freedom to think about these bold ideas, and hopefully there's ways in which Microsoft can benefit from that as well.
Now, your book talks about a complete overhaul to our economies and our politics and our societies as we know it. Where do these ideas stem from?
Well, they kind of are the intersection of two things. One were things that just came out of my academic research. There's a whole field called mechanism design, which I've worked in, which comes up with some of these sort of bold redesigns for society, but most people don't really take it very seriously. It's more viewed as a theoretical exercise. And so on the one hand, they came out of those, and I thought they were really interesting ideas, but maybe I didn't take them so seriously as a basis for changing the world. But at the same time, Brexit happened, obviously populism is on the rise throughout the world, and I've increasingly come to feel that if I think I do have serious ideas about how to fix problems of inequality, problems of low productivity growth, problems of political division, that I have a responsibility to try to take these ideas that came from this academic perspective, but put them together with a much broader range of perspectives and to see if we can turn them into a real, you call it an ideology or a movement that can help address some of these problems.
And what have you seen as a result of this book? I know you said that you're hoping that it becomes a movement and that there's maybe businesses that have come out of it. What have you seen so far?
So basically I was, for about 3 months, touring nonstop, taking 3 or 4 red eyes a week, talking about this book, doing all these things. I didn't really come up for air for about 3 months. But when I did, suddenly I found that several $1 billion worth of capital, dozens of startups have all formed around ideas in the book. And it's not just in the private sector. In the area of activism, there have been governments who've gotten really engaged with potentially using these ideas. People who are organizing political movements or just protest movements who've gotten really interested in these ideas. People are interested in funding those groups. Really a whole range of activities, all the way to arts, that have built around these ideas just in the last 3 months since the book came out. So that's been really rewarding and fascinating and has forced me to sort of change the way that I'm approaching my career and my life.
We're going to delve into the book a little bit, but can you give us a high-level overview, some of the main ideas of what the book is about?
I mean, the book is really a vision that cuts clear across the political spectrum because the concept is that markets can be a liberatory, egalitarian force, and that actually, through having more radically free markets, we can dramatically reduce inequality, boost the economy, and solve a lot of our political conflicts. And it argues that, in fact, while we think we have a free market economy, in fact, it's dominated by monopolies, and the market is excluded from some of the most important spheres, like the way that politics operates. So, on the one hand, the book, embraces the egalitarian ideals of the left very aggressively, but on the other hand, it embraces the free market, freedom-oriented ideals that dominate the right.
Your book also proposes a complete overhaul of the free market system as we know it. So, in your opinion, what's so wrong with the system as we know it today?
standard way we think about our society is that we have really free markets, that things are competitively priced, et cetera, et cetera. But what I think a lot of us don't think about is that most assets are not actually part of a free market. You know, we're sitting in a building right now. Imagine some entrepreneur wanted to use this building for a different purpose. They'd have to go to whatever commercial real estate company owns this, enter into a long and complicated process of negotiation to buy it. Probably the company would, realizing that they have something really exciting to do with it, charge them way more than the company would be willing to accept. It's really not like there's a competitive auction for everything. So the concept behind radical markets is that by making a competitive auction in some sense for everything, for all property, and using the revenue that comes out of that auction to distribute equally to everyone in society, we can both have far more competitive markets and much more entrepreneurship, much more development, and at the same time that the fruits of that development can be much more equally shared.
Tell us about the idea of partial common ownership.
Yeah, so that is this idea that I've just been describing to you, this system of self-assessed taxation. The reason why I call it partial common ownership is that ownership has two parts to it, right? You have the right to enjoy something, to get the benefits from it, to get the rents effectively of that asset. And second, you have the right to exclude other people from using it. You can stop others from making use of that thing. And both of those things in my system, in our system, are gradually transferred from the current possessors to society at large, because the tax redistributes the benefits associated with that asset from the owner to everyone. And at the same time, the fact that the tax encourages you to set a lower price on these assets so other people can access them transfers your right to exclude people to society at large.
Tell us more about the concept of the auction that you talk about in your book.
So take the example of radio spectrum. So it used to be that people would watch a television show like this over the air. But now, increasingly, people are watching things on the internet. And so much of the spectrum, so much of the rights to broadcast is reserved for radio stations and television stations that no one's really watching over the air anymore and can't be used for 5G, LTE, Wi-Fi services that are the way people actually get information these days. The government has tried to fix this in recent years by holding various kinds of processes where people can sell things, but it's really been a mess because the owners of these stations hold on to their rights. They don't sell them, and it's very hard if you need to repackage the spectrum to get access to those rights. So an alternative system that you could have is, rather than people having absolute property rights, they could assess how much that part of the spectrum is worth to them, pay a tax on that or a license fee every year. Let's say 10% of whatever they assess they have to pay to the government or whoever's administering the system, but then they have to stand ready to sell that spectrum for whatever price they assessed. That ensures that things are always available on a liquid market, that you can always see all the prices like you can in the stock market, and that you can buy up the spectrum that you need in order to use it for new purposes.
You also suggest a self-assessment system where individuals, rather than governments, declare the value of their possessions and taxes are levied accordingly. Tell us how this system would work.
Every major asset that people have, all the major business assets, for example, you would assess a price on them, you would pay a tax based on that price, and then you'd have to stand ready to sell the asset at that price. The rates of this tax would differ across different assets, but on average we estimate they should be something like 7% for the economy overall. If that were true, about 2/3 of the value of privately held assets would become effectively common property, because there would be this tax that delivers the benefits to the public, but also people will have to stand ready to sell their assets so anyone can access those assets as well. And that tax would fund enough to eliminate capital gains tax, corporate income tax, property tax, all these other taxes we currently have on assets. And at the same time, it would be enough to fund a universal basic income, you could call it, or we call it a social dividend, of about $24,000 for every family of 4. So it would dramatically increase living standards and provide ordinary people with enough funds so that they could assess the value of their assets high enough so that there would be basically no chance, unless they wanted to open them up, of those assets being taken away from them.
What are some other ideas that you have for fixing the system?
So the point is that if you set a very high price, you have to pay a high tax. If you set a low price, someone might take the asset from you because you have to stand ready to sell it at that price. And if you set the tax rate around the chance that someone will want to buy the asset from you, that's what's called the turnover rate, the rate at which assets move on to a new user or owner, then those two forces offset each other. On the one hand, you want to set a higher price because you want to be paid more if someone buys it from you. On the other hand, you want to set a lower price so you pay lower tax. So if you set the tax rate around the turnover rate or a little bit less, people will set their prices for assets around what they'd be willing to accept, what they'd be happy to get for the asset, or a little bit higher than that.
How do people who are homeowners, for example, how have they taken to ideas like this?
The ideas tend to appeal much more to people who are relatively capital poor. That happens to be the vast majority of people in the world, but maybe not the vast majority of people who are listening to this show. So the average American, the median American, has about $80,000 worth of net assets. The average American has $1 million of net assets. So there's $1 million of net assets per person in the country, but a typical person has only 80,000. So for someone like that, the system is a huge benefit. They'd receive a $24,000 a year social dividend. To maintain their assets, they'd only have to pay $1,500. If they wanted to overstate the value of the assets by so much that there's no chance anyone would ever take it, maybe they would state $10,000 tax. Then there would be almost no chance anyone would take it. They'd still get $14,000 on net. But for much wealthier people probably like us, who have many more assets, that would be much more costly. So what the tax really does is it's a tax on the sort of hoarding of security by the wealthy in the world, and a redistribution of the ability to afford security to everyone, so everyone has opportunities to access and make use of society's resources.
Take us back a little and tell us about the origins of democracy.
Democracy in Athens, in ancient Rome, etc., really begins with the notion not that one person, one vote is fair in some deep sense, but rather that there was a particular form of military organization called the phalanx, where people would get into a big group and they would have a bunch of shields and they would all march forward, and whoever had more people would win. So as a way of avoiding actually fighting things out, people would instead take a majority vote as a way of reflecting sort of their military strength. And while that started as sort of just this pragmatic thing, it obviously became a very storied idea. And when democracy started to reemerge, during the Enlightenment and just before the Enlightenment, people looked to these models, but they didn't really reflect what those people were trying to achieve. They weren't really trying to achieve one person, one vote. They were really trying to achieve the notion that the popular, will should in some sense rule. And what we've been sort of working on in the book is trying to get back to that notion, the notion that people may know or care different amounts about different issues, and that we should allow them to reflect that rather than just have a mechanical one person, one vote system.
How would that work in today's day and age?
So the idea is that everyone would have an equal endowment of what we call voice credits. These are rights to influence collective decisions, but rather than everyone getting one vote on every issue, they could spend this budget on the issues that are most important to them according to a particular rule, which is that the cost of the number of votes that you get on any given issue would be the square of the number of votes that you buy on that issue.
Does this get into your idea about collective decisions as well?
Exactly, right. So the idea is that for making decisions as groups rather than as individuals, we have to use this quadratic pricing rule rather than just one, you have a budget of votes that you can spread across things however you want. It's increasingly costly to have influence on an issue. The first vote is cheap, the next vote is more expensive, and so forth. That's called quadratic voting.
How would that work in the US in a presidential election, for example?
So the idea is that you could vote in favor of or against any candidate, and one vote in favor or against would cost 1 voice credit, 2 votes in favor or against would cost 4 voice credits. 3 votes in favor or against would cost 9 voice credits. And so the concept is that, if you think about our last presidential election, both of the candidates that ended up in the final were deeply unpopular. So if you actually looked at how strongly people supported or opposed different candidates, and you ranked all the people who ran in the primaries, Trump came in dead last, Hillary Clinton came in second to last. The most popular was John Kasich, and Bernie Sanders was second. But neither of them got in because of this weird system we have, where everyone ends up having to vote for someone just to keep the person that they don't want out of power. Under this system, you could vote in favor of or against candidates and express how strongly you felt. The strong opposition to Clinton and Trump would have kept them down and made room for others to float up above them. And that system would avoid a lot of the sort of crazy things that we have where we get candidates that nobody really wants.
Tell us about some of the issues you think there are around labor and migration and globalization today that you outlined in your book.
So globalization is not the internationalization of everything. It's the internationalization of certain things. Goods and money flow easily across borders. Rich people like ourselves can easily go across countries, but most people are tightly connected to their country and don't have that possibility of moving. And in fact, they don't even have many interactions with people from other backgrounds. And it's that imbalance in the nature of globalization that we try to address. We want to have a system which is more open to the movement of people rather than just the movement of money and the people who have money. And to do that, we need to make it so that migration doesn't just benefit the migrants themselves and the wealthy people who employ them, but it benefits every citizen of wealthy countries. Otherwise, people aren't going to be supportive of migration. It's not going to be sustainable to have large-scale migration. So we propose a system in which every citizen should be allowed to sponsor migrants and to negotiate with those migrants for some share of the benefits that the migrants receive from coming to the country, rather than just Google or whoever's employing these people, or large agribusinesses being the ones who benefit from migrants coming to the country.
What would that look like? Give us an example.
So every citizen could have, say, a ticket that would allow them to sponsor one guest worker for a period of time, or they could sponsor a permanent migrant if they use that ticket up entirely. And that migrant, most migrants to the United States send a very large share of their income back to their families in the country they came from, often as high as 75%. Out of that amount that they're sending back to their families, they would pay some of that to the person who is sponsoring them, so that the person who is sponsoring them would receive a direct economic benefit, but would also interact directly with the migrant. They would live near the person who is sponsoring them. And so people would have this sort of positive economic exchange with people who they were hosting.
So then what do you think about the system as it is today?
Well, the fundamental problem with the system as it is today is that on the one hand, actually the amount of migration is tiny. The U.S. has about 5% of its population is foreign-born. You look at places like Singapore, 50% of the people are foreign-born. But on the other hand, people are very opposed to migration. Why? Because all the benefits are going either to the migrants or to the people who are hiring them. And so most people in the country don't see a benefit from migration, just as many people don't see a benefit directly from technology. People feel left behind by all these trends. In places like Singapore, people are very enthusiastic about migration because they see direct benefits to them from it. So we need to create a system where the benefits of change, of technology, of openness are accruing to every citizen, so they see their future tied to those developments rather than being opposed to them.
What would those benefits look like if your system was implemented?
Well, most concretely, we predict that every person who sponsored a migrant, and say a family of 4 could sponsor 4, would receive about $5,000 to $6,000 per migrant that they sponsored per year. So again, that would be about a $20,000 increase in the median income in the United States, which is more than all the increases that they've received since the 1970s. So that's a huge increase in income for a median family. At the same time, the migrants would benefit dramatically. People, for example, in India, where I know you lived for a period of time, typical people there often earn salaries of $600 a year. And to come to the United States and earn $6,000 a year, it's a dramatic improvement in their ability to provide for their families at home, in their ability to make a future for themselves. So there's a huge potential benefit to the migrants as well. And beyond that, I think culturally, the mixing that this would create, people like us in sort of large cosmopolitan cities tend to be pretty open to migrants. We have lots of positive economic exchanges with them. We benefit from the diversity of food and so forth. And those interactions, if we create an economic incentive for more people and an economic ability for more people to have those interactions, I think it would also start to break down some of the barriers of hostility to migrants that many people have.
Tell us about your thoughts on asset managers and institutional investors and what their role in shaping our economy is today.
So the role of asset managers, in particular Vanguard, State Street, BlackRock, the largest asset managers, has grown hugely over the past years. In the 1970s, relatively diversified holders of assets held only 1 or 2% of the corporate economy. Now just those 4 companies hold about 20 to 25% of the whole corporate economy. And because the rest of asset ownership is very diffuse, they tend to be 4 of the 5 top shareholders of essentially every major publicly traded company. And because they hold in a diversified way, and because they have such an influence, they don't have any interest in seeing these companies compete with each other for consumers, for workers, or in the political sphere. And we've seen right along with this trend a dramatic decline in competition measured in a whole variety of ways throughout our economy. And an increasing set of research shows that these two things are linked to each other, that the rise of institutional investors is also leading to declines in wages, to increases in prices, and to reduced competition in this political sphere. So really what's happened is that you've gotten this huge agglomeration of power in this very small number of people who basically are meant to represent the overall interest of people who own capital and seeing the stock market go up, rather than people who are interested in seeing a particular company compete harder and win against its rivals. And I think that that's led to a decline in the competitive spirit that legitimates capitalism for broader society.
And so what do you propose to fix that?
So we think that what we need is that these companies, rather than owning all the competing firms in industry, rather than owning American Airlines and Delta and United, should only be allowed to own within any given industry one firm. So Vanguard could own United maybe, and State Street could own American. And you would sort of have these sports teams of asset managers who would be diversified across industries, but within any given industry, they'd have their pick. And then they would have a strong incentive to govern these companies really aggressively to make sure that the CEO wasn't making off with a huge amount of money, and to make sure that the company was competing hard within its industry. So you'd get better corporate governance because you'd have these concentrated ownership stakes, and you'd get more fierce competition.
How is industry taking to these ideas? Industry, the financial services industry, when you propose things like this,
it's very interesting because within the economics profession, pretty much everyone says, if you believe in economics, you have to sort of believe in these ideas, because it's just sort of obvious that it's a huge conflict of interest for these companies to have so much power and control things in such diversified ways. And pretty much anyone else I talk to in the public says, yeah, obviously. But within the financial services industry, people are like, no, I know those guys. Those guys are my friends. They're not reducing competition. And I think what's happened is that there's come to be a whole sort of class mentality among people who own wealth in this country, among the capitalist class, which is like basically 0.5% of the population who has more than that $1 million of assets that I was talking about. And they believe that everything that leads to an increase in the stock market must benefit everyone. But in reality, the stock market represents wealth held by a very small number of people. It doesn't represent the broad economy of the country.
So then how do you propose making markets fair again?
Well, I think that the real problem that we face is that the rhetoric of free markets, which was really intended by people like Adam Smith and Jeremy Bentham and so forth to be a force for liberating people from aristocracy and monarchy and so forth, has instead become the way in which the wealthy and powerful legitimate their control in our present society. But we need to return to the power of free markets to break up existing concentrations of power. So by taxing, as I mentioned, assets and allowing everyone to access them, by using markets to make our politics more open and cooperative, we can regain that spirit where markets were a force for liberation, where today's libertarians and today's progressives were part of a common mission to create a fairer, more equal, more competitive society.
In your book, you talk about the digital economy and digital labor unions. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So there's something called the labor share of national income that economists talk a lot about. This is what share of the value created in the economy gets paid out to workers rather than to people who own wealth. That's been dramatically declining in recent years. It's fallen by about 10%, just as we've seen rises in the share of income going to the very top. And nowhere is this stronger than in the digital sector. Facebook's labor share is about 5%. Google's labor share is about 15%. And I think that that's not based on the fact that workers are no longer useful, but because they're no longer paying the people who work for them. The people who really create the value on Facebook and Google are ordinary users of those services. The people who are supplying the data that allow them to create artificial intelligence and machine learning systems, which are supposed to be displacing us from work. But they're not really displacing us from work. They're just channeling the work that we're doing in a different way. But we're not being compensated for that. They're taking our data without paying us for it.
So then how do you propose we fix that?
We need to create new sorts of organizations that don't leave us, individuals, sort of powerless in the face of the huge monopoly power of these platforms. We need intermediate sizes of organizations, things like cooperatives, unions, royalties collecting organizations, etc., which can, on our behalf, bargain with these large platforms over the value that each of us is creating, that give us the power to have a seat at the bargaining table, but at the same time don't get so large that they become monopolies themselves.
Can you give us a real-life example of what that would look like?
So there's about 2 or 3 dozen data platforms that have started to try to create this sort of thing. I don't think any of them quite have the right model at present, and we're writing an article for the Harvard Business Review that's about what they should look like. But this idea of having some sort of a union where everyone would join and they would negotiate on behalf of users for the price that they have to pay to access their data, and these could call data strikes by sort of cutting off the access or the cookies or the ability of these platforms to follow our data if we don't get a fair share of the value that we're creating on these platforms.
You also talk about some of the biggest worker struggles in the digital economy. Can you elaborate on that a little?
Well, I think the biggest problem right now is that the people who are supplying this information aren't even aware of how much value they're adding to the platforms, of the fact that they're every day effectively working for Facebook and Google without compensation. That when you enter on a website some characters that you're supposed to read off of some printed image in order to validate your security, that you're actually training artificial intelligence systems to replace people. We don't know about that value, and so we don't know that we should form organizations to demand a reasonable share of that.
So a lot of your proposals have received some tough criticism.
Yeah.
How do you address this?
Well, look, the thing I found most interesting about the book is that while sort of especially older white men and Asian men and so forth, people with a lot of privilege and established capital have pushed back pretty hard against some of these ideas. I actually find that among young people, among marginalized groups, among people who don't have so much stake in the present system, there's a huge amount of openness. And even among people who are more established, there's a, if you spend enough time with them and you really work through it and you get them to step outside of their established ways and all the stake they have in the existing privileges in the current system, they can see the logic of why these are just better designs for social organizations, even if they themselves are benefiting from the present arrangement. So I think over time, as these ideas filter out, as they get adopted increasingly by young people, by people in the blockchain community, by entrepreneurs and artists, I think others will be forced to face the fact that the arguments that they're making are not really logical. They're more sort of just ways of defending their existing prejudices.
Very interesting. Thank you so much for joining us, Glen.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
And we'll see you next time on Sarder TV.